Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Archives. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. This happened in Australia in the 1980s, long before I was old enough to understand what it really meant. And for most of my childhood, it existed only as a lie I was told to protect me. It wasn't a ghost story or a rumor passed around by strangers. It was something that happened to my own mother, something so violent and unreal that even now it feels like it belongs in a horror movie rather than real life. Back then, my mother was young and restless, the way a lot of people are when they're trying to figure out who they are and where they belong. She and her boyfriend at the time were traveling around the country together, moving from place to place, living cheaply, working odd jobs, and enjoying the freedom that comes with not being tied down. Australia is massive, and in those days it was easier to disappear into it. You could drive for hours without seeing anyone, sleep wherever you found a spot, and meet people who felt like they existed completely outside of normal life. At one point during their travels, they ended up in a rural coastal area of Western Australia. It was beautiful in that raw, untouched way. Open land, ocean air, quiet nights, and long days. They were staying somewhere simple, nothing fancy, just a place to sleep and cook. To make a bit of money and get by, they were picking berries, something a lot of travelers did back then. That's where they met him. He seemed normal, friendly, easy to talk to. Just another guy passing through or living nearby. There was nothing about him that stood out as threatening. No strange behavior, no warning signs, no sense of danger. He chatted with them while they worked, laughed, and seemed genuinely pleasant. The kind of person you wouldn't think twice about trusting. At some point, they invited him back to where they were staying. It didn't feel reckless at the time. This was the 1980s in a quiet rural area surrounded by open land and ocean. People were more trusting. Travelers often shared meals, stories, and drinks with strangers. It was part of the culture. So they had a barbecue, cooked food, had a couple of beers, and talked into the evening. Everything felt relaxed and normal. There was no tension, no unease. As the night went on, it got late. Eventually, my mother and her boyfriend said goodnight and went off to bed. Their new friend left, or at least they believed he did. The night settled back into silence, the kind of deep quiet you only get far away from cities. No traffic, no voices, just darkness and the sound of the wind or the distant ocean. My mother fell asleep. Sometime later, she woke up. At first, it wasn't fear that woke her, it was pain. A deep, sharp pain in her back that didn't make sense. She was confused, half asleep, trying to understand why her body hurt so badly. She rolled over, still not fully awake, expecting to see her boyfriend or maybe thinking she had slept wrong. Instead, she saw a silhouette standing over her. The room was dark, but she could make out the shape of a person, someone standing too close, someone who shouldn't have been there. Before she could scream or even fully process what she was seeing, the figure raised its index finger to its mouth and whispered, "Shh, you're dying. Shh, you're dying." Those words alone are horrifying enough. But they weren't spoken by a stranger hiding in the shadows. They were spoken by the man they had shared food and drinks with just hours earlier. The nice guy they had met while picking berries. The man they had trusted. He had a hunting knife. By the time my mother fully understood what was happening, it was already too late to stop it. He had stabbed her 7 times. The pain in her back wasn't imagined. It was real and it was catastrophic. Her boyfriend had been stabbed even more times, over 10. The attack was sudden, brutal, and completely senseless. My mother's lungs were filling with blood. Every breath became harder than the last. She couldn't scream properly. She couldn't fight back. She was drowning from the inside, choking on her own blood, lying in the dark while the man who did this stood over her in a strange, detached state. He wasn't raging. He wasn't yelling. He was calm, empty, like he wasn't fully there. She begged him to call an ambulance. She pleaded with him, struggling to breathe, knowing she was dying if nothing changed. Somehow, something in her voice, or the reality of what he had done, broke through whatever was happening in his mind. He snapped out of it. The psychotic episode ended as abruptly as it had begun, and then, just like that, he called for help. An ambulance came. How they survived is something that still feels unreal. With the number of stab wounds, the blood loss, the damage to their bodies, survival shouldn't have been possible. But somehow, both my mother and her boyfriend lived. Doctors worked on them, stabilized them, and pulled them back from the edge of death. Physically, they healed. But nothing about that night ever truly went away. When I was a child, I knew my mother had scars on her back. Long, noticeable scars that didn't match any simple accident. I used to ask her about them, the way kids do, curious and innocent. She always told me the same thing, that she had fallen onto barbed wire. It was an easy explanation, one that didn't raise questions, one that didn't invite fear. I accepted it. As a kid, you trust what your parents tell you. You don't look for deeper meanings. You don't imagine that the person who tucks you into bed once lay bleeding in the dark while a man whispered that she was dying. It wasn't until I was 16 that she told me the truth. By then, I was old enough to understand violence, fear, and how fragile life really is. She sat me down and explained what had actually happened. She told me about traveling around Australia, about picking berries, about the barbecue, about waking up in pain, about the silhouette, about the whisper. Hearing it as a teenager was like having the ground pulled out from under me. Suddenly, those scars weren't just marks on her skin. They were evidence of something monstrous. Proof that my existence could have ended before it ever began. Proof that randomness and trust can collide in the worst possible way. What stayed with me the most wasn't just the attack itself, but how ordinary it all started. There was no dark alley, no obvious danger, just a friendly conversation, shared food, a normal night. It shattered the idea that danger always announces itself. Sometimes it smiles at you, eats with you, and waits until you're asleep. My mother doesn't talk about it often. When she does, she keeps it factual, controlled. But you can tell it never left her. Experiences like that don't fade. They settle into you. They change the way you see people, the way you trust, the way you sleep. For years, she carried that story alone so I could have a normal childhood. She chose to lie about the scars so I wouldn't grow up afraid of the world. Only when she believed I was ready did she tell me the truth. Even now, knowing she survived, knowing she went on to live her life, have a family and raise me, the story still feels unreal. The image of someone standing over her in the dark, whispering those words, is something I wish I had never had to imagine. But it's real. It happened. And every time I think about how easily that night could have ended differently, how close I came to never existing at all, it sends a cold feeling through me. Not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of how thin the line is between safety and horror. Sometimes the scariest stories aren't the ones that feel supernatural. They're the ones that actually happened. My dad has a friend named Gordon, and for most of my life he was just a name that came up now and then in conversation. He wasn't someone I saw often, and when I did, he seemed like a quiet, ordinary man. The kind of person who blended into the background, polite, calm, not someone you would ever imagine had lived through something truly horrific. If you met him without knowing his past, You would never guess what had happened to him. Before all of that, Gordon was a geologist. His work took him to places most people will never see in their lifetime. Remote regions, harsh landscapes, places where nature still completely dominates, and humans are just temporary visitors. One of those places was the Arctic. Vast stretches of frozen land, endless horizons, silence broken only by wind and the occasional animal. It was dangerous work, but it was the kind of danger that becomes normal when you do it long enough. You prepare, you take precautions, and you trust your experience. On the day it happened, Gordon was out collecting samples. This wasn't unusual. He had done this countless times before. He had his equipment, his truck nearby, and a plan for the day. There was nothing about that morning that suggested it would be any different from the others. No warning signs, no bad feeling that he could remember. Just another day in a place where you learn to respect the environment and hope it respects you back. At some point, everything went wrong. A grizzly bear attacked him. There was no dramatic buildup, no chance to react in any meaningful way. One moment he was focused on his work, and the next he was being mauled by an animal far stronger and faster than any human. Grizzlies are not like the bears people imagine from cartoons or documentaries watched from the safety of a couch. They are massive, powerful, and terrifyingly efficient when they decide to attack. Gordon doesn't remember much about the initial attack itself. Trauma has a way of breaking memory into fragments, and his mind did what it had to do to survive. What he does remember is pain, confusion, and the overwhelming sense that he was completely helpless. The bear tore into him using claws and teeth with a force that the human body is not built to withstand. At some point, Gordon lost consciousness. When he woke up, he didn't understand where he was at first. Everything felt wrong. His body was heavy, his head was throbbing, and he couldn't see clearly. There was dirt in his mouth, in his nose, in his eyes. Leaves were pressed against his skin. The smell was overpowering, sharp, and animal. It took him a few seconds to realize what had happened. The bear hadn't left him. Instead, it had done something far worse. The grizzly had dug a shallow depression in the ground, a kind of crude pit, and had dragged Gordon into it. The bear was in the process of burying him, covering him with dirt, leaves, and debris. And not just that. The bear had urinated on him. This wasn't random behavior. This was instinct. Grizzly bears cache their food. When they kill something they don't intend to eat immediately, they bury it to come back to later. The urine marks it, claiming it as theirs, warning other animals to stay away. Gordon, barely alive, was being treated as stored meat. Imagine waking up to that realization. Imagine realizing you are not just injured, but that a massive predator believes you are already dead, or close enough to it that it doesn't matter. Imagine understanding in that moment that the animal intends to come back and finish eating you later. Gordon tried to move and pain exploded through his body. Still, survival instinct took over. He tried to climb out of the hole. His movements were slow and weak, but he forced himself upward, using what strength he had left. That's when the bear reacted. The grizzly was still there. It hadn't wandered off. It hadn't gone far. It was close enough to notice immediately. Gordon barely had time to register its presence before it was on him again. The bear grabbed him by the head. Not his arm, not his torso, his head. The force was unimaginable. The bear cracked his skull like it was nothing. Gordon felt it, a sickening pressure and then a blinding pain. And then the bear threw him back into the hole, like discarding something unimportant, like tossing away an object. Once again, Gordon lost consciousness. When he came to the second time, he was even worse off. His head injury was severe. Blood was everywhere. His scalp had been torn so badly that it was hanging down over his eye, partially blocking his vision. He was disoriented, weak, and in agony, but somehow he was still alive, and he knew something important. If he stayed there, he would die. He didn't know where the bear was at that moment. He didn't know if it was watching him, waiting for him to move again. But he knew that his truck was somewhere nearby. Not close enough to see clearly, but close enough that if he could reach it, there was a chance. A small chance, but a chance all the same. So he made a decision that most people will never have to make. He tried to climb out of the hole again. This time, he didn't wait. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look around to see if the bear was still there. He couldn't afford to. His vision was limited. His head was splitting open, and every second mattered. He pulled himself out of the depression using pure desperation and adrenaline. Once he was out, he ran. He didn't know if the grizzly was behind him. He didn't turn around to check. He later said that the thought of seeing the bear again was worse than the thought of being attacked from behind. So he ran blind, stumbling, bleeding, barely able to see where he was going. His scalp was hanging over his eye, flapping with each step. Blood was running down his face, soaking his clothes. His body was screaming at him to stop, but his mind refused to listen. He focused on one thing only: the truck. Somehow he reached it. He doesn't remember opening the door. He doesn't remember getting inside. He only remembers that at some point he was no longer out in the open. From there, he made his way to a highway. How long it took, how he managed to drive in that condition, and how he didn't pass out again are things even he can't fully explain. Eventually, he reached a place where other people were. Help arrived. Gordon survived. Doctors later told him how close he had come to dying. His injuries were severe. The head trauma alone should have killed him. The fact that he survived being attacked, attacked again, and then still managed to escape is something that borders on unbelievable. Most people don't survive a single grizzly attack. Almost no one survives being treated as food and buried twice. That's the part that stays with me the most. He was cached twice. The bear believed he was dead twice. And twice, Gordon proved it wrong. When my dad tells this story, he doesn't dramatize it. He doesn't raise his voice or add unnecessary details. He tells it plainly, almost quietly, like someone describing a bad storm they once lived through. But every time I hear it, I can't help but imagine what that must have been like. The fear, the pain, the absolute isolation of being injured in a frozen wilderness with a predator that sees you as nothing more than meat. Gordon doesn't talk about it much himself. When he does, he doesn't dwell on emotions. He sticks to facts. But you can see it in his eyes sometimes, that distant look people get when they've seen something that changed them permanently. Experiences like that don't leave you unchanged. They carve something into you. I think about how thin the line was between life and death for him. How a shift in the wind, a slightly stronger blow, or a moment of hesitation could have ended everything. I think about how nature doesn't care about plans, careers, or families. Out there, survival is all that matters. And I think about how, against all odds, Gordon walked away. Not untouched, not unscarred, but alive. Most people will never understand what it means to be hunted, buried, and left for dead by something that sees you as food. Gordon does, and somehow he lived to tell the story. This is one of those stories that never really leaves you, especially when it involves someone you actually knew, someone who walked the same hallways you did and felt like part of the same small world. It's the kind of thing that makes everything feel less safe afterward, even places you used to think of as neutral or harmless. The kid went to my school. He wasn't a stranger on the news or a name in a headline. He was someone people recognized, someone who had classes, friends, routines. He had an ex-girlfriend, like a lot of teenagers do, and they were still in contact. At some point, he agreed to sell her his phone. It seemed simple enough. A normal, everyday interaction. Nothing about it sounded dangerous. They agreed to meet at the public library. That alone made it feel safe. A library. A public place. Somewhere people assume nothing truly bad will happen. He probably thought the same thing. If anything went wrong, there would be people around, staff, cameras, witnesses. It didn't feel like a risk. When he got there, though, things weren't what he expected. His ex-girlfriend wasn't alone. She was there with her new boyfriend. What happened next was fast and brutal. They attacked him right there, stabbing him repeatedly in the neck. Not once. Not twice. Over and over. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a fight that got out of hand. It was an ambush, deliberate and violent. Before anyone could really react, they forced him into their car. From there, it only got worse. They drove him out of town, to a field just outside the city limits. Somewhere isolated, somewhere quiet, somewhere no one would hear him screaming or see what they were doing. They beat him there, continuing the assault, as if the stabbing hadn't already been enough. Then they tried to set him on fire. That detail is the one that turns your stomach the most. The idea that someone could still be alive, injured, terrified, and then have fire added to the horror. But for some reason, he wouldn't light. Whether it was the conditions, the materials, or sheer bad luck for them, it didn't work. Instead of stopping, instead of realizing how far they had already gone, they escalated. They called a friend. They asked him to bring gasoline. While they were waiting, the kid tried to run. Even after everything he had been through, stabbed, beaten, bleeding, he still tried to escape. That alone says so much about the human instinct to survive, about how strong that drive can be, even when the body is failing. They caught him. They ran him over with their car. When the friend arrived with the gas can, the situation crossed into something almost impossible to comprehend. At that point, it wasn't just rage or panic. It was cruelty layered on top of cruelty. They poured gasoline on him. They set him on fire. And then they ran him over again. That's when he finally died. Reading that sentence doesn't feel real even now. It feels like something from a horror movie, something exaggerated and unreal. But this wasn't fiction. This happened to someone from my school, someone who probably woke up that day thinking he was just going to sell a phone and move on with his life. Afterward, the kids involved didn't turn themselves in. They ran. They hid out in a larger town, thinking distance would protect them, thinking they could disappear into somewhere bigger, somewhere anonymous. For a short time, they did exactly that. What ended it wasn't guilt from the main attackers. It was the friend, the kid who had been called to bring the gasoline. Something about that moment broke through whatever denial or fear he was living in. Maybe it was the reality of what he had helped enable. Maybe it was panic. Maybe it was the weight of knowing he was now part of something unforgivable. Whatever it was, he turned them in. That's how they were caught. When the story spread, it hit the school like a shockwave. People didn't know how to talk about it. Some refused to believe it at first. Others couldn't stop talking about it, replaying the details over and over, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense at all. The library didn't feel the same afterward. Neither did breakups, or meeting up with people you used to trust, or the idea that public places automatically mean safety. It shattered the illusion that violence is always random or distant, something that happens somewhere else to someone else. What stays with me the most is how ordinary it all started. A phone sale, an ex, a public place, normal teenage life, and how it ended with unimaginable brutality. It's a reminder of how quickly things can turn, how trust can be weaponized, and how cruelty doesn't always look monstrous at first. Sometimes it looks familiar. Sometimes it looks like people you already know. That's the part that really messes with you. Not just that something so horrific happened, but that it happened. So close to home. to someone who was supposed to be safe, doing something completely normal. And once you know that, the world never quite feels the same again. When my parents and I came to the United States in the 1990s, everything in our lives changed at once. A new country, a new language, a new culture, and a completely new environment. I was still a kid, young enough that most things felt confusing but also exciting. I didn't fully understand what was happening, only that we had left behind everything familiar and were starting over somewhere far away. We moved into an apartment complex not long after arriving. It wasn't anything special, just a group of plain buildings similar to many others you see in older neighborhoods. To me, it was simply our new home. I didn't think much about it at first. I was more focused on adjusting to school, making sense of English, and trying to feel normal in a place where everything felt different. It didn't take long, though, before I started hearing stories. The people who already lived there talked a lot. Neighbors would chat in hallways, outside near the parking lot, or while checking mail. That's where I first heard the rumors. They said the apartments were haunted. They talked about strange noises at night, shadows moving where no one should be, and a general feeling that something wasn't right. The story that came up the most was about a woman in white. People claimed they had seen her walking around the complex late at night, drifting through hallways or across the courtyard. As a kid, those stories scared me. They stuck in my head more than I wanted them to. At the same time, I tried to act like I didn't care. I told myself they were just stories, things people made up to entertain themselves or scare each other. I didn't want to be the kid who believed in ghosts. So even though the rumors bothered me, I pushed them aside and didn't give them much thought. At least, that's what I told myself. Within the first few months of living there, things started happening. Small things at first, easy to dismiss if you didn't think too hard about them. But each experience added another layer of unease, even if I didn't fully understand it at the time. One of the first things I remember happened during the day. That's important because it wasn't late at night, and I wasn't half asleep. I was fully awake. I was lying on my bed, just resting. My bed didn't have a headboard, so there was a small gap between the top of the mattress and the wall. Nothing unusual about that. I had been lying there for a while, doing nothing in particular. Suddenly, my pillow moved. Not slowly, not like it slipped or fell. It was pushed upward from underneath the bed, hard enough that it felt deliberate. It was exactly like someone had punched it from below. The movement was sudden and forceful. I felt it clearly. I sat up immediately, my heart jumping. I leaned over and looked down, expecting to see something. Maybe my brother messing with me. Maybe something had fallen, but there was nothing. No hands, no objects, nothing under the bed at all. I just, sat there, confused. I remember feeling puzzled more than scared at that moment. My brain tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe the mattress shifted. Maybe I imagined it. But the movement had been too strong, too specific. Still, I didn't tell anyone. I brushed it off and moved on, telling myself it was probably nothing. Another incident happened at night while I was washing dishes. The kitchen lights were on and everything felt normal. I was standing at the sink, focused on what I was doing. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. That feeling you get when you sense someone watching you. It's subtle, but unmistakable. Your body reacts before your mind does. I slowly turned my head to the left. Standing there was a figure that looked exactly like my dad. For a brief moment, I felt relief. I assumed he had walked in quietly and was just standing there. But the second I fully turned to look at him, the figure vanished. It didn't walk away. It didn't fade slowly. It disappeared instantly, like it had never been there at all. I stood frozen, staring at the empty space. My heart started racing. I turned off the water and went to find my dad. I found him in the living room, sitting on the couch, watching TV. He hadn't moved. He hadn't been in the kitchen. There was no way it could have been him. I didn't know what to think. I didn't tell him what I saw. I didn't want to sound crazy, and I didn't want to scare myself even more by talking about it. So once again, I kept it to myself. The most terrifying experience happened at night while I was sleeping. I shared a room with my brother and we slept on the same bed. That alone usually made me feel safer. Having someone else there made the dark less intimidating. That night, I fell asleep like normal. I don't know how long I had been asleep when it happened. I woke up suddenly. Something was grabbing my foot. The grip wasn't gentle. It was firm enough that there was no doubt in my mind that something was holding me. My entire body tensed up instantly. Fear shot through me before I even had time to think. I pulled my foot away. A second later, it grabbed me again. That was when panic fully set in. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. I felt trapped in my own body. I didn't scream. I couldn't. Fear locked my throat. Instead, I curled up into a fetal position, pulling my legs close to my chest. I started hyperventilating, trying to breathe quietly so I wouldn't draw attention to myself. I didn't know what to do. Eventually, I forced myself to move just enough to wake my brother. I didn't tell him what happened. I was too scared to say it out loud. Instead, I asked him some random, meaningless question, something stupid, just to hear his voice and confirm that I wasn't alone. He answered sleepily, clearly annoyed at being woken up. He said he was tired and rolled over, falling back asleep almost immediately. Not long after, somehow, I fell asleep too. Looking back, that part unsettles me the most. The fact that I was so terrified, and yet my body still shut down from exhaustion. Fear didn't keep me awake forever. Eventually, sleep came, whether I wanted it or not. Other things happened over time. Not always physical, but always strange. Shadows where there shouldn't be shadows. The feeling of being watched when no one was there. Sounds that didn't have a clear source. Nothing dramatic enough to point to one single explanation, but enough to make me uneasy. Enough to make the apartment feel different from any other place I had lived. At the time, I didn't analyze any of it. I was a kid. Kids accept things more easily than adults do. They don't always question reality the same way. Strange experiences don't automatically mean something supernatural to a child. They're just part of life. Weird, confusing, but not something you sit down and logically dissect. So I grew up. We eventually moved away from that apartment complex. Life went on. School, friends, responsibilities. Those experiences faded into the background of my memory. I didn't think about them often. When I did, I told myself they were probably just childhood imagination, fear mixed with stories I had heard from neighbors. That explanation was comfortable. It allowed me to move on. But time has a way of changing perspective. Now, as an adult, I look back on those experiences differently, with a more developed mind, with logic, skepticism, and a better understanding of how fear and memory work. And yet, even with all that, I can't fully explain what happened in that apartment. The pillow being pushed wasn't a dream. I was awake. The figure that looked like my dad wasn't a trick of darkness. The kitchen was lit. The hand grabbing my foot wasn't sleep paralysis. I was able to move, react, and wake my brother. Individually, maybe each event could be explained away. Together they form a pattern that's harder to ignore. What really stands out to me now is how consistent the feeling was. That sense that something else was there. Not always visible, not always active, but present. Like the apartment itself carried something with it. Something that didn't belong. When I think about the stories I heard when we first moved in, about the woman in white and the strange sightings, I can't help but wonder if those people were experiencing the same things in their own ways. Maybe they saw what I felt. Maybe they felt what I couldn't see. I don't know what caused it. I don't know who or what was responsible. I don't claim to have answers. All I know is that those experiences felt real, and they stayed with me long after we left. As a child, I didn't label it. As an adult, I can say this with confidence. The apartment we lived in was absolutely haunted. I was around 24 years old when this happened, old enough to think I had already seen enough of life to not be easily shaken. I wasn't reckless, but I also wasn't especially sensitive. I had seen accidents before, heard sirens, passed by scenes that made other people slow down and stare. I was always the kind of person who kept walking. I never liked looking. It felt invasive, like witnessing someone else's worst moment without permission. So I trained myself not to stare, not to slow down, not to let those images stick in my head. That day started out completely normal. I was at a friend's house, just hanging out, nothing special planned. At some point, we decided to go get coffee. There was a really nice coffee place about 5 blocks away from his house, the kind of place you don't mind walking to, especially on a decent day. We both had our dogs with us, and it seemed like a good excuse to take them out for a walk at the same time. No rush, no stress, just a casual walk for coffee. We headed out, dogs on leashes, talking about nothing important, the kind of conversation you don't even remember later. The streets were familiar, calm, and quiet in that everyday way that makes you feel safe. Nothing felt off. Nothing felt heavy. About a block before we reached the coffee shop, I noticed something ahead of us. There had clearly been a car accident right at the corner where the coffee place was. Even from a distance, I could tell. There was an SUV stopped awkwardly, and a police car parked nearby. No flashing chaos, no ambulances screaming in yet, just enough to signal that something had happened. Normally, that would have been my cue to look away. I don't slow down for accidents. I don't stare. I don't want those images in my head. I've always believed that once you see something like that, it never really leaves you, so I usually keep my eyes forward and my pace steady. This time, though, it didn't look that bad. At least, not from where we were. There was no wreckage scattered everywhere, no obvious signs of something horrific. It looked contained, manageable, almost calm. So we kept walking. As we got closer, I started to notice more details. The SUV was stopped at an odd angle, and the police car was parked close by, blocking part of the street. There was also a Domino's Pizza motorcycle nearby. That stood out to me immediately. It wasn't lying flat the way you'd expect after a serious crash. It was just there, close to the SUV, like it had been placed there rather than violently thrown. And then I saw him, the delivery driver. He was alive. That fact alone is something that still feels strange to say, because of where he was. He was trapped between the SUV's wheel and the body of the car, not under it in the way you might imagine, not pinned flat. He was wedged into a space that didn't seem physically possible, the kind of space where a human body simply should not fit, honestly. It looked like a place where not even a dog could squeeze into, let alone a grown man. But he was there, alive. Half of his body was twisted unnaturally, and one of his legs was bent up near his head in a way that made my stomach drop instantly. It wasn't gore in the dramatic sense. There wasn't blood everywhere. That almost made it worse. His body was intact enough that your brain tried to understand how it had ended up like that, and it couldn't. I stopped walking without realizing I had stopped. Time slowed down in that way it does when your brain is trying to process something it isn't prepared for. I remember thinking that it must have just happened, that they were waiting for more help to arrive. There was no ambulance yet, no crowd of emergency responders, just a policeman nearby, watching the scene, probably making sure no one interfered. What haunts me the most isn't just the position of the man's body. It's the faces. I remember the delivery driver's face clearly, too clearly. His eyes were open. He wasn't screaming, but there was pain there, shock, confusion, the kind of expression you see when someone hasn't yet fully understood what has happened to them, but knows something is terribly wrong. I remember the driver of the SUV, too. His face was pale, frozen, like he had already gone somewhere else mentally. The kind of look people get when they know their life has just split into a before and an after. I remember the policeman's face as well. Calm, controlled, but heavy, like someone doing their job while carrying the weight of the moment quietly. I remember every single detail, the way the street looked, the angle of the vehicles, the stillness of the scene. Even the sound around us felt muted, like the world had decided to hold its breath. My dogs were calm, unaware of what they were standing next to. That contrast alone made my chest feel tight. I didn't want to be looking, but I couldn't look away. There was something deeply unsettling about the fact that he was alive in that position. Death would have made it easier to process, in a strange, uncomfortable way. But this was worse. This was a human being caught in a moment where survival and death were still undecided. A moment stretched thin, fragile, and terrifying. I remember feeling a sudden wave of guilt for being there at all, for seeing it, for being a witness when I had no right to be. I felt like I was intruding on something sacred and awful at the same time. Someone else's pain, someone else's worst day, burned into my memory without permission. Eventually, we moved on. I don't remember exactly how. I don't remember what my friend said, if anything. I don't remember if we even got the coffee. If we did, I don't remember drinking it. The rest of that day feels blurred, like my mind decided it wasn't important enough to keep once that image had taken up so much space. What stayed with me was the scene. I replayed it in my head later that night. The impossible angle of his body, the way his leg was near his head, the fact that he was conscious, alive, trapped, waiting. I wondered what happened to him after we left, whether he survived, whether he ever walked again, whether he remembered the faces of strangers who saw him like that. I never found out, and maybe that's part of why it still bothers me. Since that day, nothing about accidents feels neutral anymore. Whenever I see flashing lights ahead, whenever I notice traffic slowing down for something on the side of the road, my body reacts before my mind does. My eyes instinctively turn away. My pace quickens. I don't look. I still don't look. Not because I'm afraid of blood or chaos, but because I know what a single image can do. I know how one moment, one glance, can carve itself into your memory and stay there forever. I know how easy it is to accidentally carry someone else's trauma with you for the rest of your life. That man on the motorcycle didn't choose to be seen like that. He didn't choose for strangers to remember him at his most vulnerable, twisted into a space no human body should ever occupy. And I didn't choose to see it, but I did. That image lives somewhere in my mind now, untouched by time. I can still see his face if I let myself. I can still see the driver, the officer, the street corner, all of it, frozen. So now, when there's an accident, I keep walking. Not because I don't care, but because I care enough to know that some things, once seen, can never be unseen. This story still gives me chills every time I think about it, even now, years later. It's one of those things that stays with you, not because it's loud or dramatic, but because of how quiet and deliberate it all was. The kind of tragedy that unfolds slowly behind closed doors, while the rest of the world keeps moving like nothing is wrong. It happened in September of 2017. From the outside, the family looked completely normal. A father, a mother, and their 6-year-old son. Nothing about them stood out in a way that would make anyone suspicious. They lived in an apartment like thousands of other families. They had routines, responsibilities, and plans, the kind of life that blends into the background of everyday society. At the beginning of September, the little boy was registered into school. That alone should have been a sign of a future, of plans being made, of a life moving forward. School registration is usually a hopeful moment for parents. It's the start of something new, a milestone. No one could have imagined that it would also be one of the last normal things this family ever did. Shortly after that, the father and the boy disappeared. At first, no one panicked. The mother had taken the first few days of September off work, officially listed as time off for a family occasion. That didn't raise any alarms. People take time off all the time, especially around big moments like starting school. It seemed reasonable. There was no immediate reason for co-workers or neighbors to worry when she wasn't answering calls or showing up. Silence at first didn't feel dangerous, but then the days passed. The mother wasn't heard from. No messages, no calls, no updates. Still, that alone might not have been enough to trigger concern. Some people like privacy. Some families go away without telling many people. Life can get busy. What changed everything was her father. Her father was a retired police officer, a man who had spent his life learning to notice patterns, to trust his instincts, and to recognize when something wasn't right. When he tried to reach his daughter and couldn't, that instinct kicked in. He didn't immediately assume the worst, but he didn't ignore it either. He went to check on her. When he arrived at the apartment building, something immediately felt wrong. Her car was parked out front, exactly where it always was. That alone wouldn't have meant much if it had been there for a day. But it had been there for days. It hadn't moved. No one had driven it. No one had gone anywhere. For a retired cop, that detail mattered. He tried again to contact her. Nothing. No answer. No response. Just silence. That's when concern turned into fear. Using his old connections, he contacted former colleagues. He explained the situation, his concerns, and what he had observed. They agreed that something wasn't right. Arrangements were made to enter the apartment. When they broke in, what they found was something no parent should ever have to see. The mother was in the bathtub. She was still alive when they found her, but barely. She had cut her veins deeply. The scene was horrifying, not just because of the physical reality of it, but because of the timing. They had arrived just moments too late to save her. She was taking her last breaths as they found her. There was nothing they could do. She died there in the bathtub, in her own home. As devastating as that discovery was, it wasn't the end of the nightmare. In some ways, it was only the beginning. They found a suicide note. The note was written calmly, deliberately. There was no chaos in her words, no rambling, no confusion. That in itself made it even more disturbing. She wrote that she and her husband could not bear the thought of raising their child in this world. She believed the world was coming to an end, that everything was doomed, that there was no future worth living through. It wasn't written like a moment of panic. It was written like a conclusion. She spoke about the state of the world, about fear, about hopelessness, about how she believed she was protecting her child from something far worse than death. It was the kind of thinking that feels impossible to understand unless you are deep inside it. Logic twisted into something unrecognizable by despair and delusion. And then there was something else. Along with the note, she had drawn a map, not a vague sketch, not a confusing scribble, a clear map pointing to an exact location near the city, in the woods. She had marked the spot carefully, intentionally, as if she knew that eventually someone would need to find them. That map led to the bodies of her husband and her son. Using the map, authorities went to the location she had indicated. It wasn't far from the city, but it was secluded enough that no one would stumble across it by accident. Deep enough into the woods that it felt hidden, but not so remote that it would be impossible to reach. There, they found them. The father and the 6-year-old boy were lying together. According to local gossip and reports that circulated afterward, they were covered with blankets, arranged as if they were sleeping, not thrown away, not left carelessly, carefully placed, deliberately tucked in. That detail alone is enough to haunt anyone who hears it. They weren't posed like victims of violence. They were posed like loved ones being put to bed. The cause of death was poisoning. There were no signs of struggle. No evidence that the child had fought back. No chaos at the scene. Everything suggested that it had been done quietly, calmly, as if the parents believed in their own twisted way that they were doing something gentle, something merciful. That idea is almost harder to process than outright brutality. The father was there too. Whether he agreed with the plan, whether he was coerced, whether he believed the same things as his wife, or whether he was poisoned without knowing what was happening is something no one can say for certain. That question hangs over the entire story like a shadow. Did he believe the world was ending too? Did he think he was saving his son? Or did he trust his wife and follow her into something he didn't fully understand? Those answers died with them. What makes this story especially disturbing is how planned it all was. This wasn't a sudden breakdown. This wasn't a moment of uncontrollable rage. Everything points to days, maybe weeks, of preparation. Time taken to think, to decide, to commit. The mother took time off work under the excuse of a family occasion. The boy had just been registered into school, as if life was continuing normally. The father and son disappeared quietly. The mother stayed behind, long enough to write the note, draw the map, and then end her own life. Each step feels intentional, and that's what makes it so terrifying. There were no warning signs obvious enough for outsiders to intervene. No dramatic cries for help. No public breakdowns. Just a family that appeared normal until it suddenly wasn't. After the news broke, people talked. Neighbors, co-workers, locals. Everyone tried to make sense of it. Rumors spread as they always do. Some said the parents were obsessed with apocalyptic ideas. Others claimed they had fallen into extreme beliefs about the end of the world. Some said the signs were there if people had only looked closely enough. But hindsight is always clearer. The truth is, most people never see these things coming. Mental illness, fear, and delusion can hide behind normal routines. People can smile, go to work, talk about school registration, and still be unraveling inside. What stays with me the most is the image of that child. 6 years old, just starting school, just beginning to understand the world, too young to question the adults around him, too young to understand fear on that scale, trusting the people who were supposed to protect him more than anyone else, in the world, covered with a blanket, as if sleeping. That image alone is enough to make your stomach turn. And then there's the mother's father, a retired cop who spent his life protecting others, only to be unable to save his own family. The pain he must have felt finding his daughter like that, and then knowing what she had done, is impossible to fully imagine. No amount of training prepares you for that kind of loss. This story doesn't scare me in the way ghost stories do. It doesn't rely on shadows or whispers or things that go bump in the night. It scares me because it's real, because it shows how fragile the human mind can be, how fear, when left unchecked, can turn love into something unrecognizable. It reminds me that sometimes the most horrifying things don't come from monsters or the supernatural. They come from people who believe, with absolute certainty, that they are doing the right thing. Even now, years later, thinking about it sends a cold feeling through me. The quiet planning, the note, the map, the blankets, the belief that the world was ending and that death was the only escape. It's the kind of story that makes you pause and look at the people around you differently, makes you wonder what battles are being fought silently behind closed doors, makes you realize how important it is to take fear, despair, and hopelessness seriously when you see it in others, because sometimes by the time the truth comes out, it's already far too late. This is one of those stories that makes anger sit heavy in your chest long after you hear it. Not the kind of anger that flares up and fades, but the kind that stays quiet and bitter because nothing about what happened feels fair. No matter how many times you think about it, the outcome never makes sense. It happened in Ontario, Canada, in 2015. The man at the center of it all was the son of a very wealthy family. His parents owned a successful business in Toronto, the kind of family that never has to worry about money, connections, or consequences in the same way most people do. He had grown up with comfort, opportunity, and protection. Doors opened easily for him. Mistakes were softened. Life, for him, had always had a safety net. That year, he was about to get married. Like many people with money, his bachelor party wasn't a simple night out with friends. It was a trip to Las Vegas, private jet, alcohol flowing freely, no limits, no concern for moderation, no thought about what came next. Just indulgence, excess, and the assumption that nothing truly bad could happen. By the time the trip was over, he was heavily intoxicated. Anyone with basic common sense would have known they were in no condition to drive. Anyone with even a shred of responsibility would have arranged a ride, called someone, waited, or simply not gotten behind the wheel. But entitlement has a way of blinding people. When you grow up believing rules are flexible and consequences are negotiable, danger doesn't feel real. He landed back in Canada and went straight to his car at the airport. He got behind the wheel. He drove. What happened next destroyed multiple families forever. On the road that night was a minivan carrying a family. Inside were a grandfather, his wife, and 3 of their grandchildren. They weren't doing anything reckless. They weren't speeding. They weren't drunk. They were just a family traveling together, living their lives, unaware that someone else's selfish decision was about to end everything they knew. The crash was violent. The drunk driver slammed into the minivan with enough force to kill 3 children instantly. Their grandfather was also killed. 4 lives gone in a matter of seconds. 4 people who had plans, futures, routines, and people who loved them deeply. The grandmother survived, and that survival came with a cost that is almost impossible to comprehend. In one moment, she lost her husband and 3 of her grandchildren. Her entire immediate family gone. The parents of those children lost not only their kids, but also their father. A single crash wiped out generations of a family tree. There are no words that can properly describe that kind of loss. The aftermath was devastating. Funerals instead of birthdays, silence where laughter used to be, empty bedrooms, toys that would never be touched again, a house that suddenly felt too big and unbearably quiet, parents who would never again hear their children's voices, a wife who would never again speak to her husband, all because one man chose to drive drunk. When the case went to court, many people expected justice, or at least something close to it. After all, 4 people were dead. 3 of them were children, innocent children who had no say in the matter, no chance to protect themselves. But justice in cases like this often feels painfully small. He was sentenced to 10 years, for killing 4 people, for erasing an entire branch of a family, for leaving parents with a lifetime of grief that no sentence could ever ease. 10 years felt like nothing compared to the damage he caused. It felt like a number chosen for convenience rather than meaning. A sentence that acknowledged the crime on paper but failed to reflect the reality of the loss. In 2018, just 3 years after the crash, he applied for parole. That alone was enough to reopen wounds for the families involved. The idea that someone who had taken so much could already be asking for freedom was unbearable. Thankfully, his parole application was denied, but even that small relief was overshadowed by the knowledge that he would eventually walk free. The children would not come back. The grandfather would not come back. The family would never be whole again. And yet, the man responsible would one day return to his life, his resources, and his support system. What makes this story even harder to swallow is the imbalance, the unfairness of it all. The driver came from wealth and privilege. He had access to good lawyers. He had a family with money and influence. He had options. The victims did not. The families of those children did nothing wrong. They followed the rules. They trusted the road. They trusted that other drivers would act responsibly. That trust cost them everything. The parents of those children didn't just lose their kids. They lost their sense of safety, their belief in fairness, their ability to imagine a future without pain. Every milestone that should have been joyful became a reminder of absence. Every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary day carried the weight of who should have been there. The grandmother lost her husband and grandchildren in one instant. She survived physically, but survival doesn't mean living. It means waking up every day with memories that never fade and grief that never truly heals. And the man who caused it all, he lived. He got a sentence. He got a chance at parole. He got sympathy in some corners. That's what enrages people the most about stories like this. Not just the crime itself, but the system that seems to cushion those who already have everything. The feeling that if he had been poor, unknown, or without connections, the outcome might have been different. Drunk driving is not an accident. It's a decision to ignore reality, a decision to prioritize convenience over safety, a decision to believe that nothing bad will happen, or that if it does, it won't be that bad. In this case, that decision wiped out 4 lives and shattered many more. Calling him an entitled rich jerk doesn't even begin to cover it. Entitlement is believing you deserve more than others. This was worse. This was a complete disregard for human life. A belief that the rules didn't apply to him, and that even if they did, the consequences wouldn't be severe enough to matter. Stories like this linger because they force us to confront uncomfortable truths. That wealth can soften punishment. That justice is not always proportional to harm. That the people who suffer the most are often the ones who had no power at all. It also forces us to think about how fragile life really is. How one reckless choice can ripple outward, destroying people who had nothing to do with it. How a single night of excess can leave decades of grief behind. There is no lesson here that hasn't already been said 1,000 times. Don't drink and drive. Take responsibility, think about others. But hearing those words doesn't bring back 3 children or a grandfather. It doesn't heal the parents or the widow. It doesn't undo the damage. All that remains is the anger, the sadness, the knowledge that this never should have happened, and the haunting reality that it will probably happen again because someone else will make the same selfish choice, believing they are untouchable. That's what makes this story so hard to forget. Not just the loss, but the injustice of it all. The imbalance between what was taken and what was given in return. 4 lives for 10 years. No sentence will ever be enough. In my hometown back in the 1970s, there was a story that everyone seemed to know, even if no one liked to talk about it out loud. It was one of those things that lived quietly in the background of the town's memory, passed along in hushed voices, usually when people were talking about how different things used to be. or how dangerous the world could be beneath its calm surface. I didn't hear it all at once. I heard it in pieces over time until the full weight of it finally settled in. It started as an ordinary errand. Two young sisters, both still very young, drove into town to go to the local grocery store. They were just going to pick up some milk. Nothing unusual, nothing risky. It was the kind of small task people did every day without thinking twice. In a small town, especially back then, it felt safe. People trusted their neighbors. People trusted the roads. Girls could run errands without fear being part of the calculation. They parked their car and went inside the store. While they were shopping, something had already gone wrong. Two men had slashed their tires while they were inside. The sisters didn't know that yet. They came back out, groceries in hand, expecting to get in their car and drive home. Instead, they found the tires ruined, flat, useless, stranding them right there in the parking lot. That alone would have been frightening, but before they had time to fully understand what had happened, the men appeared. They were waiting. They approached the sisters and offered them a ride home. They acted helpful, calm, normal. They knew exactly what they were doing. The sisters were young, shaken, and suddenly stuck. This was before cell phones, before easy ways to call for help. They were vulnerable, and the men took advantage of that vulnerability. The sisters accepted the ride. That decision, made under pressure and fear, changed everything. Instead of driving them home, the men drove them out of town, far out of town, more than 20 miles away, toward a lake. The farther they went, the more isolated the road became. Trees replaced buildings. Darkness replaced familiarity. By the time the sisters realized they weren't going home, it was already too late. What happened to them out there was brutal. The men raped both sisters. There is no way to soften that word, and no reason to try. It was violence in its purest form, an act meant to dominate, to destroy, to take something that could never be given back. The sisters were terrified, powerless, and completely at the mercy of people who saw them as nothing more than objects. Afterward, the men decided to make sure there would be no witnesses. They drove the sisters to a dam with an extremely high bridge, the kind of bridge that makes your stomach drop just looking down from it. The water below was dark and cold. The drop was deadly. They threw the sisters over the bridge. They left them there, believing they had killed them. For most people, that would have been the end of the story. 2 young lives erased. Another tragedy buried under time and silence. But this story didn't end the way the men expected. One of the sisters survived. She didn't escape unharmed. Her body was shattered, her back was broken. The pain must have been unbearable. But somehow she didn't die when she hit the water. Somehow she stayed conscious enough to fight for her life. She managed to swim to shore. That alone feels almost impossible. Swimming with a broken back in cold water after everything she had already endured. Every movement must have sent pain through her body. Every breath must have felt like fire, but survival instinct is powerful, especially when death feels close enough to touch. She reached the shore and pulled herself out of the water. It was night. She was alone, injured, far from town. No shelter, no help. The cold was relentless. Hypothermia was a real threat. Her body was already in shock, and the night stretched on endlessly. What saved her, at least in part, was her long hair. When it finally dried, it helped keep her warm through the night. It sounds like a small thing, almost insignificant. But in situations like that, small things can mean the difference between life and death. She lay there, broken and exhausted, clinging to whatever warmth she could retain, waiting for morning. When daylight came, she didn't give up. Despite her injuries, she dragged herself, inch by inch, through pain that most people can't even imagine. She pulled herself toward a county road, driven by nothing but the need to survive. Her body was failing her, but her will refused to stop. Eventually, she reached the road, and then, by what can only be described as a miracle, a young couple happened to pass by. They saw her, they stopped, they helped her. If they had driven by just minutes earlier or later, she might not have been there anymore. She survived, physically at least. The town was shaken when the story came out. People couldn't believe something so horrific had happened so close to home. The sense of safety shattered overnight. Parents held their children closer. People locked their doors more carefully. Trust didn't come as easily anymore. The sister who survived became a symbol of strength to some, a reminder of horror to others. She had lived through something that should have killed her, something that would haunt anyone forever. She endured surgeries, recovery, and the long road of physical healing. But some wounds don't show up on X-rays. The trauma stayed. She carried it with her for years, decades. People often assume that surviving means winning, that once someone lives through something terrible, the story turns hopeful. But survival doesn't erase what happened. It just means you have to live with it. She lived with the memories, the fear, the pain, the knowledge of what had been taken from her. She lived with the loss of her sister, who didn't survive. She lived with the weight of being the one who made it out, while the other didn't. And then, many years later, the story took its final, devastating turn. She committed suicide, not just anywhere. She jumped from the same bridge where her life had nearly ended decades earlier, the same place where unimaginable violence had been done to her, the same place that had marked her forever. That detail is what makes the story unbearable to think about. It wasn't just an act of despair. It felt like a full circle, like the trauma had never loosened its grip, like that bridge had become a symbol of everything she couldn't escape, no matter how many years passed. People in town still talk about it, even now. Not often, not casually, but when they do, their voices drop. There's a shared understanding that this wasn't just a crime, and it wasn't just a suicide. It was the long echo of violence stretching across decades. It's a reminder that what happens to someone in a single night can shape the rest of their life. That surviving doesn't always mean healing. That some experiences leave scars so deep they never truly fade. Whenever that bridge comes up in conversation, there's a pause. People look away. Some refuse to cross it at all. Others do, but they never forget what happened there. The water below looks the same as it always has. Calm, quiet, unaware of the pain it once held. But the story remains. And it still chills people to this day. This happened when I was really young, maybe second or third grade, back in the early 1990s. That was the time when schools were very serious about teaching kids stranger danger. We had assemblies about it, talks in class, worksheets, and teachers repeating the same rules over and over. Don't talk to strangers, don't get into cars, don't tell people where you live. At that age, most of it felt abstract, like something that happened to other kids in movies or on the news, not something that would ever actually happen to me. Until it did. I was walking home from school like I had done countless times before. It wasn't a long walk, and it was a route I knew well. I felt comfortable enough doing it on my own, and my parents trusted me to get home safely. The neighborhood wasn't rough or dangerous. It was the kind of place where kids rode bikes. Neighbors waved, and nothing really bad ever seemed to happen. I was just walking, probably thinking about something completely unimportant, when a car pulled up next to me. It wasn't screeching tires or anything dramatic. It just slowed down and matched my pace. I looked over, and there was a young man in the driver's seat. I didn't recognize him at all. He didn't look scary in the obvious way. He wasn't yelling or acting aggressive. He just leaned slightly toward the open window and spoke to me like it was the most normal thing in the world. He asked me where I lived. That question alone flipped a switch in my head. All those lessons from school suddenly came rushing back. Stranger danger. Don't give information. Don't talk. Don't engage. I don't know why, but instead of freezing or blurting out the truth, something in me stayed calm enough to think. I lied. I pointed in the wrong direction and told him to drive straight. I don't remember exactly how confidently I said it, but I remember committing to it fully. I didn't hesitate. I didn't second-guess myself. I gave him a clear direction that had nothing to do with where I actually lived. He nodded and drove off. I watched the car until I couldn't see it anymore. The second it disappeared from view, my body reacted all at once. Adrenaline hit me like a wave. I didn't walk anymore. I ran. I took off as fast as my legs could carry me, straight down my actual street. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. I didn't even run to my own house. There was a neighbor's house closer than mine, and without thinking, I ran straight to her door. I knocked frantically, probably looking terrified. She answered, saw my face, and immediately knew something was wrong. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I told her enough for her to understand that I was scared and that a man had stopped me in his car. She didn't question it. She didn't brush it off. She walked me home herself. That walk felt completely different from the one I had been on just minutes earlier. Every sound felt louder. Every car passing by made my stomach tighten. I was hyper-aware of everything around me. When we finally reached my house, I felt a strange mix of relief and lingering fear, like my body didn't quite believe I was safe yet. As soon as I got inside, I told my dad what had happened. I had never seen my dad move like that before. The second I finished telling him, he didn't hesitate. There was no calm discussion, no slow reaction. He moved fast, purposefully. He went straight to his gun safe, unlocked it, loaded his pistol, and pulled out a shotgun. The speed alone scared me. My dad wasn't a hothead. He wasn't someone who went looking for trouble. But he also wasn't someone who would sit around and wait if he thought his kid might be in danger. The look on his face told me everything. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't an overreaction. This was a father who thought someone might be trying to hurt his child, and he was ready to do whatever he had to do to stop it. At that moment, the reality of what could have happened really hit me. The fact that the guy knew me, or at least knew enough to stop and talk to me, while I had no idea who he was, made it feel even worse. That imbalance was terrifying. I remember realizing that if things had gone differently, if I had answered honestly, if I had hesitated, the outcome could have been very different. My dad didn't go hunting anyone down, but he was absolutely prepared if that car came back. And then came the twist. It turned out the man wasn't a predator at all. He was the oldest son of one of my dad's good friends. He had been bringing over a car for my dad to look at, something they had talked about previously. He recognized me, knew who I was, and thought nothing of pulling over to ask where my dad lived. In his mind, it was harmless, friendly even. In my mind, it had been terrifying. Once everything was explained, the immediate danger evaporated, but the intensity of the experience didn't. Even knowing the truth, my body remembered the fear, the running, the pounding heart. The image of my dad loading weapons like time mattered more than words. It wasn't a scary outcome, but the events themselves were still wild. A perfect example of how perspective changes everything. What was innocent on one side felt life-threatening on the other. After that, my family doubled down on safety. We had a secret password. It was something only family members or trusted people would know. If anyone ever came to pick me up or talk to me claiming they were sent by my parents, they had to know that password. If they didn't, I was not to go with them no matter what they said. It became one of those rules that stuck with me deeply, drilled into my brain as non-negotiable. Years passed. Life moved on. That incident faded into the background, becoming one of those childhood stories that gets brought up occasionally, but doesn't feel real anymore. I grew up, I went to college. I became an adult. The world felt different when I was the one walking around freely, making my own decisions. Then, maybe 10 or 15 years later, something happened that brought it all rushing back in the strangest way. I was in my early 20s at a party on the opposite side of the country. It was one of those gatherings with old family friends, people I hadn't seen in years, maybe even decades. Time had blurred everything together. Faces were familiar but not immediately recognizable. Names floated just out of reach. I was standing there talking to someone when a man walked up to me. He was probably in his mid-40s, definitely older than me by a good margin. I didn't recognize him at first. He smiled and said a single word, the secret password. I froze. It wasn't a common word, not something you would guess, and I hadn't heard it in years. Hearing it come out of a stranger's mouth stopped me cold. My brain scrambled to catch up with what my instincts already knew. I could trust him. The reaction was immediate and almost automatic, even though I hadn't consciously thought about that password in a long time. It was like something deep in my memory clicked into place. Then it all made sense. It was him. The kid who had nearly gotten his head blown off years earlier when he tried to talk to me from his car. He had grown up just like I had. He remembered the incident. He remembered how badly it could have gone. And he remembered the rule about the password. He told me later that when he realized who I was at the party, he knew exactly how strange it would be for a grown man to walk up to a woman in her 20s and start talking like he knew her. So he figured the safest way to break the ice was to lead with the one thing that would instantly tell me he wasn't a threat, the safe word. We laughed about it afterward, but there was something surreal about the whole moment. Two people connected by a misunderstanding from childhood, meeting again decades later, both carrying the memory of how close things had come to going very wrong. Looking back now, that experience shaped me more than I realized at the time. It taught me that fear isn't always irrational. Sometimes it's your instincts doing their job. It taught me that adults don't always think through how their actions look from a child's perspective. And it taught me the value of preparation, of having plans in place before you need them. That day could have been nothing. It also could have been everything. And the fact that it ended with a laugh years later doesn't change how real it felt in the moment. The running, the panic, the sight of my dad ready to protect me at all costs. Those things stayed with me, not as trauma, but as a reminder that sometimes doing exactly what you were taught can make all the difference. There are some stories you come across that don't just disturb you for a moment, but lodge themselves somewhere deep in your mind and refuse to leave. You can go about your day, try to distract yourself, even forget the details for a while, but the feeling they create stays with you. This is one of those stories. It's the kind of thing that changes how you look at people, how you think about cruelty, and how fragile the idea of safety really is. When I first learned about what happened to Junko Furuta, it genuinely kept me awake for days. She was a Japanese high school student, just a normal teenage girl with a life ahead of her. School, friends, plans, worries that were probably no different from anyone else her age. There was nothing about her that marked her as someone destined for horror. That's part of what makes the story so unbearable. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous. She wasn't doing anything reckless. She was just existing. She was kidnapped by boys she knew, classmates. That fact alone is deeply unsettling. Not strangers lurking in the shadows, not faceless criminals, but people she recognized. People she likely saw every day. People who spoke the same language, lived in the same world, and understood exactly what they were doing. The betrayal in that is hard to fully grasp. After she was taken, she wasn't killed quickly. She was kept prisoner. What followed wasn't a single act of violence, but a prolonged period of unimaginable abuse. She was repeatedly raped. She was beaten. She was burned. She was tortured in ways that go far beyond what most people can even imagine, let alone survive. The cruelty wasn't impulsive or momentary. It was sustained, deliberate, repeated. Over time, the abuse escalated. Her body was broken down piece by piece. Her injuries were severe, and she was denied medical care. She was treated not as a human being, but as an object, something to be used, discarded, and abused further. There are suspicions that she was shared with many other men, possibly connected to organized crime. The scale of it is overwhelming, and even thinking about it feels wrong, like your mind is brushing up against something it isn't meant to hold. As time passed, her physical condition deteriorated horribly. Infection set in. Her body began to fail. Even then, the abuse didn't stop. There was no mercy, no moment where someone stepped in and said enough, no sudden awakening of conscience, just continued violence until there was nothing left for her body or mind to give. Eventually, after yet another beating, something inside her broke. Not just her body, but her spirit. She died. That detail haunts me more than almost anything else. Not just that she died, but that she endured so much before it happened. That death may have come not as a sudden event, but as a release from pain that had gone on far too long. It forces you to confront the limits of human endurance and the horrifying reality that people can push someone past those limits without stopping. After her death, the people responsible tried to hide what they had done. They attempted to dispose of her body by encasing it in concrete, as if that could erase what had happened, as if burying the evidence could somehow bury the truth. But it didn't work. She was discovered. The crime came to light, and then came the part that enrages almost everyone who learns about this case: the punishment. Only one of the boys involved received a sentence of 20 years in prison. The others received much lighter sentences. Considering the scale and severity of what they did, the punishment feels grotesquely inadequate. It feels like the legal system failed her almost as badly as the people who tortured her did. There is no sentence that could ever truly match the harm done, but what they received feels like a mockery of justice. That imbalance is part of why this story stays with people. Not just the violence itself, but the aftermath. The realization that even when the truth comes out, even when the horror is undeniable, consequences can still fall painfully short. That sometimes the systems meant to protect people and deliver justice simply don't. When I first read about this case, I made the mistake of going too deep. I read details I wish I could erase from my memory. I couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept circling back to the same questions. How could this happen? How could so many people participate and no one stop it? How could teenagers be capable of something so monstrous? How could a society allow such a light punishment afterward? It shattered any comforting illusion I had about cruelty being rare or limited to obvious villains. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a momentary lapse. It was sustained, group violence carried out by people who went back to their normal lives in between acts. That realization is deeply unsettling because it suggests that evil doesn't always look like madness or chaos. Sometimes it looks disturbingly ordinary. I genuinely warn people now when this story comes up. Not in a dramatic way, but honestly. If you don't already know the details, you don't need to read them. Knowing the name and the general outline is enough to understand how horrific it was. Going deeper doesn't bring insight or closure. It just adds weight to your mind that's hard to put down. This story changed the way I think about humanity. It forced me to accept that there are depths of cruelty that don't come with obvious warning signs. That people can smile, go to school, talk about normal things, and still be capable of unimaginable harm. That systems meant to protect the vulnerable can fail spectacularly, and that sometimes the world really is far more brutal than we want to believe. Junko Furuta wasn't a symbol. She wasn't a cautionary tale by choice. She was a person whose life was stolen in the most horrifying way possible. Remembering her means acknowledging that reality even when it's uncomfortable. And that's why this story stays with people. Not because it's shocking in a sensational way, but because it strips away comforting illusions and leaves you face to face with how horrible people can be when nothing stops them. If there is any mercy in this story at all, it's that she is no longer suffering. And if there is any responsibility on those who learn about it, it's to remember her with seriousness and respect, and to understand just how important it is to take cruelty, power, and accountability seriously. Some stories don't just scare you, they change you. My brother and his wife live in Indiana, where winter isn't just cold. It's the kind of cold that settles in and stays. Snow is a normal part of life there. You expect it, you plan for it. You shovel driveways, scrape windshields, and learn to read the weather without thinking too hard about it. Snowstorms come and go, and most nights are quiet in that heavy, muffled way that only snow can create. This happened on one of those nights. Nothing unusual had happened during the day. No strange phone calls, no weird encounters. Just a normal evening. They had dinner, watched some TV, let the dogs out one last time, and eventually went to bed. They have 2 Labrador retrievers, big dogs, usually calm and friendly, not the kind that bark at every little sound. If those dogs made noise, there was usually a reason. Sometime in the middle of the night, the dogs went absolutely crazy. Not a single bark or a quick warning growl. They were running through the house, barking loudly, frantic, nails clicking on the floor as they moved from room to room. It was the kind of barking that instantly wakes you up, the kind that tells you something is wrong. My brother woke up immediately, heart already racing before he was fully conscious. At first, he thought maybe the dogs needed to go outside, or maybe they had heard another animal, like a raccoon or a stray cat. That happens sometimes, especially in winter when animals are desperate for food and shelter. He got out of bed and went to calm them down. He spoke to them quietly, told them everything was fine, checked the doors and windows quickly. He didn't see anything out of place. No broken locks, no open doors, nothing that immediately explained their behavior. Eventually, the dogs settled down enough for him to go back to bed. A few minutes later, it happened again. The dogs started barking just as intensely as before. Same frantic energy, same running around the house. This time, it felt different. Not just annoying or inconvenient, but unsettling. My brother got up again, more alert now, adrenaline kicking in. He went back out, trying to calm them down once more. Again, he didn't see anything. The house was quiet. The night outside was silent. Snow covered the ground, reflecting faint light, making everything look still and peaceful. Too peaceful. He checked the doors again, made sure everything was locked, spoke firmly to the dogs, and eventually, they calmed down. After that, the rest of the night passed without interruption. No more barking, no more movement, just silence. By morning, the whole thing felt strange but distant, like a bad dream that doesn't quite stick once you wake up. My brother got ready for work, as usual. Showered, dressed, grabbed his things. The dogs were calm, acting completely normal, like nothing had happened. When he opened the door to leave, that's when he saw it. Fresh snow covered the ground around the house, clean, untouched, except for the footprints. there were two separate sets, not animal tracks, not random marks from snow blowing around. Clear human footprints, two different sizes circling the house, walking slowly, deliberately around the perimeter. They went up to every ground-level window, every door, the back door, the side windows, even the windows that most people wouldn't think to check. It was obvious what had happened. Someone or two people had been walking around their house in the middle of the night, while they were asleep, while the dogs were barking, while my brother was getting up and going back to bed, thinking everything was fine. The footprints weren't rushed. They didn't look like someone running or panicking. They looked careful, intentional, like whoever made them was taking their time. That detail is what makes it so disturbing. If it had been one set of footprints, maybe you could explain it away. A drunk neighbor, someone lost, a person cutting through yards, still unsettling but possible. But two sets, two people moving together, circling the house, checking windows and doors. That's different. That feels planned. The realization hit him all at once. The dogs hadn't been barking for no reason. They hadn't been reacting to an animal or random noise. They had been reacting to people. People close enough to the house to be seen, heard, or smelled. People who were actively checking the house while everyone inside was asleep. The thought of how close it had come made his stomach drop. If the dogs hadn't barked, would those people have tried a door? Would they have broken a window? Would my brother and his wife have woken up to something far worse than barking? There's no way to know, and that uncertainty is sometimes worse than knowing exactly what would have happened. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the tracks, replaying the night in his head. The timing suddenly made sense. The first round of barking, the second, the way it stopped after he got up twice. It was entirely possible that whoever was outside realized the house wasn't empty, realized the dogs were alert, realized someone inside was awake, and decided to leave. That idea alone is chilling. They had been close enough to hear the dogs, close enough to hear my brother moving around, close enough to know they were noticed, even if they weren't seen. And at some point, they chose to walk away instead of pushing their luck. My brother said later that he had never felt so creeped out in his life. Not during storms, not during power outages, not during any other strange moment. This was different. This was the feeling of having been watched, of having been evaluated, of having been a potential target, without ever knowing it at the time. Snow has a way of revealing things that would otherwise stay hidden. Footprints don't lie. They don't fade immediately. They sit there frozen in place, showing you exactly where someone walked, where they stopped, where they lingered. In this case, the snow told a story that the night itself had kept secret. After that, everything about the house felt different. The windows didn't feel like just windows anymore. The doors didn't feel like simple barriers. Every ground-level opening felt vulnerable in a way it never had before. The dogs, who had always been companions, suddenly felt like guardians. Their barking wasn't annoying anymore. It was comforting, proof that something was watching over the house when the people inside couldn't. They called the police, of course, but there wasn't much to be done. No broken entry, no suspects, no cameras that caught anything useful. Just footprints and a bad feeling. By the time anyone could have investigated properly, the tracks would be gone, erased by time, weather, or shoveling. Life went on, as it always does. But that night never really left them. Even now, years later, my brother still talks about it sometimes. Not dramatically, not for attention. Just as a quiet reminder of how close things can come without you ever realizing it. How safety can feel solid one moment and paper thin the next. What bothers him the most isn't just that someone was outside. It's that there were two of them. Two people together, moving through the snow, circling a house in the middle of the night, checking windows and doors while a family slept inside. Two people whose intentions will never be known. Two people who vanished as quietly as they arrived. And the only reason anyone knows they were ever there at all is because snow remembers what the night tries to hide. That's the part that stays with you. The idea that danger doesn't always announce itself with noise or violence. Sometimes it comes softly, step by step, leaving only footprints behind. And sometimes the only thing standing between you and something terrible is a pair of dogs that refuse to stop barking. This is one of those periods of my life that still feels unreal when I think back on it, like it belongs to someone else or happened inside a bad dream that went on far too long. Even now, years later, the memories come back in fragments. Sounds, images, feelings, not always in order, but always heavy. It started around Halloween. A friend and I were walking outside at night, just doing what people do around that time of year. The air was cold, the streets were busy, and there were a lot of people out. Halloween decorations were everywhere. Fake skeletons, hanging figures, props meant to shock or scare. Nothing about that night felt unusual at first. As we walked, we noticed a crowd ahead of us. A fairly large group of people had stopped near a tree. People were pointing, whispering, staring. Then, one by one, they just kept walking. No one seemed particularly alarmed. No one was calling for help. It looked like the kind of thing people pause at briefly and then move on from. When we got closer, we saw why. There was a figure hanging from a tree. At first, we thought the same thing everyone else probably did. A Halloween decoration. Something meant to look disturbing. It made sense, given the time of year. But something about it felt wrong. The way the body hung, the stillness, the silence around it. Decorations usually look exaggerated or fake. This didn't. We stopped. Other people kept walking past us, glancing and then moving on, like it was nothing more than a prop. That part still bothers me. How easy it was for so many people to assume it wasn't real and keep going. How thin the line is between shock and indifference when people don't want to get involved. We decided to look closer. We took out our phones and shined the light up into the tree. The second the light hit his face, everything changed. There was no mistaking it anymore. This was a real person, our neighbor, hanging there, motionless. Panic hit instantly. We didn't stop to think. We didn't debate what to do. We ran toward him, got him down from the tree as fast as we could, and tried to resuscitate him. We did everything we could think of, everything we had ever been taught, even though our hands were shaking and our minds were racing. But it was too late. He was gone. Standing there afterward felt surreal, like time had slowed down or lost meaning. The crowd that had been there earlier was gone. Sirens eventually came. People asked questions, but I barely remember any of that clearly. What I remember is the weight of it. The realization that we had just found someone who had ended their life, and that we were the ones who had tried and failed to bring him back. That night stayed with me. I replayed it over and over in my head, wondering how long he had been there, wondering how many people had walked past him, wondering if anything could have been done differently. Those questions don't have answers, but that doesn't stop your mind from asking them. Anyway, I didn't have much time to process it. A couple of months later, on New Year's Day, my life shattered again. I was a witness to my stepdad committing suicide. There's no easy way to say that, no wording that softens it. Being there, seeing it happen, knowing you can't stop it, is something that changes you. It's a moment that splits your life into before and after. Everything that came before feels distant. Everything that comes after is shaped by it. That day is burned into my memory in a way I wish it wasn't. I don't need to describe what I saw. The fact that I was there is enough. The shock, the disbelief, the overwhelming sense that this couldn't be happening again. Not after what had already happened just weeks earlier. It felt impossible. 2 suicides, 2 months apart. One a neighbor discovered by chance, the other someone deeply woven into my life. It was too much for my mind to absorb. It felt like the universe had gone wrong somehow, like reality had slipped into something darker and refused to correct itself. Those months and the time after felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I went through the motions of life, but nothing felt real. Days blurred together. Nights were worse. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it wasn't restful. I'd wake up with my heart racing, images flashing through my mind without warning. Ordinary things became triggers: trees, silence, holidays, the smell of cold air at night. Grief didn't come in neat stages, it came in waves. Sometimes I felt numb, like my emotions had shut down completely. Other times it hit me out of nowhere, overwhelming and suffocating. Guilt crept in too, even when I knew logically that it didn't belong there. The human brain looks for control in situations where there is none, and blame feels like control, even when it's misplaced. I spent a lot of time in counseling after that. At first, it felt strange to sit in a room and talk about things. That felt too big for words. But over time, it became necessary. I needed somewhere to put the weight of what I had seen. Somewhere safe to say things I couldn't say to friends or family. Counseling didn't erase the memories, but it helped me learn how to live with them without being crushed by them. What I learned most is that witnessing death like that leaves marks you can't see. It changes how you look at people, how you think about crowds, how you interpret silence. It makes you realize how much pain can exist just beneath the surface of everyday life, hidden in plain sight. I still think about that night around Halloween, about how many people walked by, about how easily something real was mistaken for something fake. And I think about New Year's Day and how cruel timing can be. A day meant to symbolize beginnings, hope, and fresh starts, forever tied in my mind to loss. Those experiences reshaped me in ways I didn't understand at the time. They made me more aware, more cautious, more sensitive to the quiet signs of struggle in others. They also taught me that it's okay to need help after seeing things no one should have to see. Life eventually moved forward because it has to, but those months will always exist as a dark chapter in my memory. Not something I dwell on constantly, but something that shaped who I became afterward. It really did feel like a nightmare, and waking up from it took a long time. I was 20 years old, and it was summertime. One of those warm nights where sleep feels optional and time stretches out in a strange way. I was with 3 friends, just wandering around downtown Millau in France at around 1 in the morning. Millau isn't a big city. It's quiet, rural, and when you're young, there really isn't much to do late at night. So you walk, you talk, you kill time together because being bored alone feels worse than being bored with friends. Downtown Millau has narrow streets that twist and turn. Old stone buildings pressed close together and public lamps everywhere. At night, those lamps usually make the city feel safe. Every corner is lit. Every street has that soft yellow glow that keeps shadows from getting too deep. Even when no one else is around, the light gives you the feeling that the city is awake in some small way. That night, though, the streets were empty. Not just quiet, but completely empty. No cars, no voices, no open bars spilling. Light and noise onto the sidewalks. Just the 4 of us and the sound of our own footsteps echoing off the buildings. We didn't think much of it at first. Small towns shut down early. That's normal. Still, there was something about how alone we were that made everything feel slightly off, even before anything happened. We were walking toward the corner of Saint-Antoine Street and Saint-Antoine Boulevard, talking about nothing important, laughing, joking, half paying attention to where we were going. The lamps above us hummed softly, and the light made the stone walls look pale and flat. That's when we saw her. A woman was coming toward us from the opposite direction. At first, she was just a shape moving through the light. As she got closer, details started to stand out, and that's when the unease crept in. She didn't walk normally. Her movements were erratic, like she couldn't decide where to look or where to go. Her eyes were darting around constantly, scanning the street, the buildings, the air above us. She looked disconnected from her surroundings, like she wasn't fully present. Her clothes were strange, not just unfashionable or mismatched, but wrong somehow. Layers that didn't make sense for the weather, colors that clashed harshly under the streetlights. Her hair was dirty and wild, sticking out in different directions like it hadn't been brushed in a long time. Everything about her gave the impression of chaos. The moment she noticed us, her expression changed. She locked onto our group and suddenly shouted, loud enough to make all of us flinch. "I am sorry, I am so sorry." Her voice echoed down the empty street. It wasn't angry, it wasn't threatening. It sounded desperate, panicked, like someone confessing to something terrible without fully understanding it themselves. We slowed down instinctively, unsure what to do. None of us answered. We just stared at her, confused and uneasy. And then it happened. At the exact moment. She finished speaking. The lights went out. Not just one lamp. Not just the street we were on. Everything. The lamps above us flickered once and then died, plunging the street into complete darkness. It was instant. 1 second we were standing under bright public lighting, and the next we were blind. A massive power outage hit the city. Later, we would learn that no less than half of Millau lost power at that exact moment. But at the time, all we knew was that the world had gone black. Absolute darkness, the kind you don't expect in a city. No ambient glow, no distant lights, just nothing. Before we could even react, the woman screamed again. "Did I just do that? It's me? I'm sorry. What have I done?" Her voice sounded closer now, distorted by panic and the way sound carries differently in the dark. We couldn't see her anymore. We couldn't see anything. Just 4 people standing frozen in the middle of a street, suddenly stripped of sight, with a screaming woman, somewhere nearby, claiming responsibility for the darkness itself. Fear hit us all at once. It wasn't a slow build. It was instant, primal fear. The kind that bypasses logic and goes straight to your legs. None of us said a word. We didn't discuss what to do. We just ran. We turned and sprinted away from her as fast as we could, shoes slapping against the pavement, hearts pounding in our ears. In the darkness, the city felt completely different. Streets we had walked 100 times suddenly felt unfamiliar and dangerous. Corners disappeared. Distances were impossible to judge. Every shadow felt like something waiting to grab you. We ran blindly at first, just trying to put space between us and that voice. I remember my breathing being loud and uneven, the sound of my friends running beside me barely reassuring at all. The woman kept shouting behind us, her words blending into panic and noise, and then eventually fading as we got farther away. When we finally slowed down, we realized we were lost. Without the streetlights, Millau became a maze. The narrow streets all looked the same. The buildings loomed like dark walls on either side of us. We tried to recognize landmarks, but everything we relied on was invisible. No signs, no illuminated windows, no clear sense of direction. We stuck close together, moving carefully now, afraid of running into something or someone. Every sound made us jump. A distant door closing, the wind moving through an alley. Our own footsteps sounded too loud, too exposed. What terrified me the most was the silence between sounds. Cities are never truly quiet, but that night came close. With the power out, There was no hum of electricity, no distant traffic noise, no background life. Just darkness and the feeling that we were being watched, even though we knew that was probably just our fear talking. Eventually, after what felt like forever, we managed to find our way back home. When we finally reached a familiar door and got inside, the relief hit me so hard my legs felt weak. We locked the door behind us and just stood there for a moment, breathing, listening, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The power came back later. Life returned to normal. The city woke up the next day like nothing strange had happened. People talked about the outage casually, a technical issue, a failure somewhere in the system. Nothing mysterious, nothing supernatural. But that explanation never fully satisfied me. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Logically, I know power outages happen. I know cities lose electricity for mundane reasons all the time. I know mentally unstable people exist, and that her reaction could have been random or even triggered by the outage itself. But the timing, that's what I can't shake. What were the chances that a woman would shout an apology, and at the exact moment she finished speaking, half the city would go dark? What were the chances that she would then scream as if she believed she had caused it? That we would be standing right there at that corner at that exact second? Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just bad luck layered on top of coincidence, amplified by darkness and fear and youth. Maybe my brain connected dots that were never meant to be connected, but I've never experienced anything like it before or since. I've been scared in my life. I've been in dangerous situations. I've felt fear that made sense. This was different. This felt unreal. Like the rules of cause and effect had slipped for a moment, just enough to make reality feel unstable. Even now, years later, I still think about that night sometimes, about the woman's eyes, about her voice, about the instant the lights went out, about how fast fear can take control when the world suddenly stops making sense. I tell myself it was coincidence, but some coincidences leave marks, and that one still does. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments, and in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives, because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.